Welcome to Silent Secrets. I'm your host for tonight's mystery. Today's tale begins with a quiet moment, a simple knock, a forgotten letter, and a truth that was never meant to be discovered. But one hidden secret, buried in the shadows, will turn an ordinary day into a night no one will ever forget. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Silent Secrets and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We love seeing how far these mysteries travel. Now settle in, dim the lights, and let's uncover tonight's silent secret. Chapter 1. Fey snowfall over Haraway. Manor. The wind swept fiercely across the open moors, driving fine needles of snow against the darkened windows of the train as it wound its way toward the village of Haraway. Inside the compartment, warm and gently lit, Hercule Poirot sat with his hands neatly folded upon the polished handle of his cane. His immaculate attire, dark coat, gloves, and a precisely knotted scarf, remained entirely unruffled despite the journey. Opposite him, Captain Hastings rubbed his hands briskly together and glanced out at the gathering storm. "It will be a harsh night for Christmas Eve," Hastings remarked. "Bracing, though I imagine Haraway Manor is equal to any weather the county can muster." Poirot offered a small, thoughtful smile. "One hopes so, my friend. Yet I find that in such weather, the English countryside becomes curiously dramatic, and where there is drama, one may often find the seeds of human trouble." Hastings laughed lightly. "You see mystery everywhere. We are merely visiting Lady Eleanor Haraway for the holiday festivities. Nothing more sinister than that, surely." Poirot tilted his head, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. A holiday invitation, yes, but Lady Eleanor's tone in her letter was not entirely festive. There was an undercurrent, how shall I put it? A heaviness. One felt she had something she wished to say but dared not commit to paper. Hastings was about to respond when the train whistle sounded, echoing against the hills. Moments later, the station lamps of Haraway village emerged through the swirling snow like wavering halos. The train slowed, brakes hissing, until it came to a halt with a soft jolt. They stepped onto the platform, where the cold air struck with sharp immediacy. A village footman in a thick coat hurried forward to greet them. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings." "Lady Eleanor sent the carriage." "This way, sirs. Quickly, if you please, the roads are turning treacherous." As they followed the man, Hastings observed the village square, faintly visible through the storm. Lanterns hung from posts and windows, glowing warmly. Garlands strung with dried oranges and ribbons adorned doorways. Despite the biting cold, a group of children were singing carols, accompanied by the distant toll of the church bell from St. Nicholas, Haraway village. For all the weather's hostility possessed an undeniable charm. They rode in relative silence until the silhouette of Haraway Manor loomed ahead, a sprawling estate of grey stone framed by ancient oaks whose skeletal branches groaned under the weight of snow. Lights glimmered from the windows, softened by frosted panes. Inside the grand entrance hall, warmth enveloped them at once. A colossal fir tree decorated with intricate ornaments dominated the space. Servants moved briskly but quietly, carrying parcels, trays, and candles. The air smelled faintly of pine and mulled spice. Lady Eleanor Haraway descended the staircase with measured grace. She was elegant, though unmistakably weary. Age had not diminished her dignity, but the faint shadows beneath her eyes betrayed strain. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, it is a delight to have you with us for Christmas." Her smile was warm, yet Poirot noted its fleeting quality. "You are most gracious, Lady Eleanor," Poirot said, bowing over her hand. "We are honored by your invitation. I hope the journey was not too dreadful." "On the contrary," Hastings replied. "Quite invigorating." Lady Eleanor laughed softly, then gestured toward a pair of double doors. "Come, join the others in the drawing room. Most of our guests have arrived." As they entered the drawing room, Hastings whispered, "A splendid gathering, what?" Poirot, however, had already begun observing. The first person to approach was Arnold Drake, a wealthy industrialist whose booming voice filled the room before he fully stepped into it. He was a large man, dressed in a bold tartan waistcoat that seemed barely capable of containing him. "Poirot, Lady Eleanor tells me you have graciously agreed to share your Christmas with us. Splendid, splendid indeed." Drake's handshake was firm, overly so, and his cheer had the brittle shine of something polished too quickly. Poirot inclined his head. "A pleasure, Mr. Drake." "Well then," Drake slapped his thigh, causing a nearby servant to jump. "If ever a village deserved a grand Christmas, it is Harroway. I have funded a ceremony at St. Nicholas this year. New bells fitted, specially cast in London tonight. At midnight, they ring for the first time." His enthusiasm, though energetic, had an edge of tension, like a man determined to enjoy himself through force of will. Poirot registered it without comment. Across the room, a young man stood apart from the others, leaning against the mantel, Thomas Harroway, Lady Eleanor's son. His posture was restless, shoulders slightly hunched, fingers tapping against the stone as though impatient or troubled. His gaze flicked repeatedly toward the doorway, as if expecting, or dreading, someone's arrival. Lady Eleanor introduced him with a gesture. "Thomas, dear, Mr. Poirot and Captain Hastings have arrived." Thomas offered a curt nod. "Welcome. I hope you enjoy your stay." His tone lacked warmth, and though he attempted a polite smile, it faltered almost immediately. Poirot noted the faint tremor in his hands before he tucked them into his pockets. "Your mother is most kind," Poirot said gently. "Harroway Manor has a most distinguished atmosphere." Thomas exhaled tightly, distinguished. Yes, and old. Very old. His gaze slid away. Before Poirot could inquire further, raised voices drifted from the hall, muffled, hurried, and quickly hushed. Poirot caught only fragments, a low protest, a sharper reply, then silence. When Lady Eleanor glanced anxiously toward the sound, her composure wavered. "Excuse me for just a moment," she murmured, slipping away. Hastings looked at Poirot. "Did you hear that? A quarrel, perhaps?" Poirot lifted a finger. "Not a quarrel, rather. A conversation one wished overheard by no one. And Lady Eleanor's reaction. Ah, that was telling. But surely nothing is amiss. This is Christmas Eve." Poirot's voice lowered. "My friend, human hearts do not defer their troubles for the holiday season." As they moved farther into the room, Hastings surveyed the guests. A solemn clergyman spoke softly, with a middle-aged woman who clutched her shawl too tightly. A maid hurriedly passed by, her eyes lowered, though not before Hastings noticed the redness around them. She had been crying, and throughout the gathering, Poirot sensed a peculiar unease beneath the festive attire and polite greetings. At that moment, the great clock in the hall began to chime the hour. Conversation paused briefly. Arnold Drake raised his glass and exclaimed, "Soon the bells of St. Nicholas will ring in a new chapter for this village," a symbol of hope. Poirot's gaze drifted toward the snow. Laden windows, hope. Yes, but also perhaps the heralding of something darker. As the evening wore on, music played and guests mingled. But Poirot observed carefully. Lady Eleanor moved among her guests with impeccable manners, yet her eyes darted toward Thomas with a mixture of worry and fatigue. Thomas slipped away several times, disappearing down back corridors. Drake's jovial facade cracked whenever he received a folded note from a servant. Tension intertwined like threads in a tapestry, subtle yet undeniably present. When Hastings finally suggested they retire for the night, Poirot agreed. But before leaving the drawing room, he took one final glance around. A household waiting, a hostess afraid, a son burdened, and a patron of the church whose generosity came with shadows. Outside, the storm intensified. Snow fell thick and fast, blanketing the world in white and smothering all sound. Poirot murmured softly. "A curious Christmas Eve. Mon ami, one feels that beneath this delicate snow, something lies hidden." Hastings shivered. "But surely nothing dramatic will happen tonight." Poirot gave him a look, gentle, but precise. "On the contrary, Hastings, it would not surprise me in the least." And above Harroway village, the bells of St. Nicholas waited in silence for their midnight debut. unaware that before they could ring, darkness might already be descending upon those gathered at the manor. Chapter 2. Fay, the midnight bells. Snow fell in thick, swirling sheets as the villagers of Harroway made their way toward St. Nicholas Church. Lanterns bobbed like dim stars along the winding path, their warm glow casting halos upon the drifting white. The church itself, ancient, steadfast, its tower rising proudly against the storm, stood adorned with holly and evergreen branches. Tonight was a night of tradition, reverence, and community, a night for blessings, a night for beginnings. Inside, the nave was bathed in gentle candlelight. Shadows flickered across the carved pews and the stained glass windows, where the colors of saints and angels shimmered faintly beneath the illumination. Families huddled together, shaking off the snow and stamping life back into chilled feet. Whispered greetings passed from one person to another, mingling with the rustle of coats and the faint scent of pine. Reverend Paulson, a tall, soft-spoken man with thinning hair and a grave yet kindly demeanor, stood near the chancel, greeting parishioners with a smile that betrayed a hint of nervous anticipation. This year's midnight service held particular significance, the unveiling of the newly cast bells, a gift from Arnold Drake. Their first peal was meant to mark a turning point for the village, symbolizing prosperity, unity, and the renewal of hope. At the organ, Michael Trent settled onto the bench, his long fingers poised above the keys. A quiet man with a contemplative look, he had served as the church's organist for over a decade. Though not given to dramatic expression, tonight there was an intensity about him, as though the music he was about to offer carried an unspoken weight. Hercule Poirot and Captain Hastings arrived with Lady Eleanor Harroway, their breath misting in the cold air as they stepped inside. Hastings removed his hat with a sense of reverence. Poirot smoothed the ends of his immaculate moustache. "A beautiful service, no doubt," Hastings whispered. "Quite atmospheric." Poirot looked around with deliberate slowness. "Atmosphere, yes, but also tension. Look at the faces, mon ami. They wait for something." "Perhaps for the bells," Hastings suggested. "Perhaps," Poirot murmured. As the final villagers trickled in, the heavy wooden doors were pushed shut against the howling wind. Reverend Paulson raised his hands, and the murmurs gradually faded into a solemn hush. "On this night," he began, his voice steady yet resonant, "we gather in fellowship to welcome light into darkness, hope into uncertainty. May the ringing of our new bells mark a bright chapter for Harroway Village." Michael Trent pressed the first chord on the organ, a deep, warm tone that filled the church like a comforting embrace. The congregation joined in hymn, their voices rising and falling with the music, weaving together in a tapestry of devotion. Poirot observed the crowd. Thomas Harroway stood near the aisle, his jaw tight, his eyes distant. Lady Eleanor clasped her gloved hands a little too tightly, and Arnold Drake, larger than life even in sacred surroundings, sat near the front with an expression torn between pride and unease. His booming cheer from earlier was noticeably absent. The minutes slipped by, and as the final hymn concluded, a quiet expectancy descended upon the room. Reverend Paulson nodded toward the tower. "Midnight approaches. Let us prepare to welcome the bells." The clock in the nave began to toll, each chime reverberating through the rafters. The entire congregation seemed to hold its breath. When the 12th chime faded, a heavy silence fell. Then, the first peal, a great, resonant sound rolled down from the tower, strong and pure. A wave of emotion rippled across the faces in the pews. The second peal followed, deeper, smoother, like a promise unfurling. But on the third, a harsh, jarring clang tore through the air. It was entirely wrong, discordant, abrupt, as though struck with violence rather than rhythm. Several villagers gasped. Children turned in fear. Lady Eleanor gripped the pew before her. And then, faint, muffled, there came a sound from high above in the belfry. A cry short, stifled, nearly swallowed by the fourth peal that thundered after it. Poirot's head snapped upward, his expression sharpened. Hastings glanced at him in alarm. But the bells continued their scheduled ringing, one after the next. completing their triumphant debut as though nothing were amiss. Yet something was very amiss. As the final reverberation faded into the storm, Reverend Paulson hesitated, his composure wavering. I believe we shall conclude with a prayer," he began. But before he could continue, a young bell ringer, his face pale as the snow outside, burst through the narrow door by the choir stalls. "Reverend!" he cried. "Reverend, sir, you must come at once." Gasps spread through the congregation. Reverend Paulson hurried forward. "What is it, Henry? Speak clearly." "It's Mr. Drake, sir. He's..." Poirot moved swiftly. "Take us." The boy, trembling, led them toward the stone passage that spiraled upward into the tower. Hastings followed close behind, his breath coming quickly. The cold grew sharper as they climbed, and the dull creak of the ropes overhead mingled with the distant moan of the storm. At last they reached the belfry landing. The door had been forced halfway open, like something heavy had collided with it. Snow had drifted inside, gathering in small white heaps upon the ancient stones, and there, near the center of the floor, lay Arnold Drake. He was crumpled grotesquely, as though collapsed mid-motion. His coat was dusted with snow, his hands rigid, frozen as though grasping at something that had not been there to help him, and on the side of his head, a terrible wound, dark and wet beneath the lantern light. Hastings staggered back. Good heavens! Reverend Paulson murmured a prayer under his breath. Poirot knelt beside the body but did not touch it. Instead, he looked up, observing everything with acute precision. The ropes above swayed gently, though no one had touched them. Their movement seemed almost accusatory, as though pointing toward the bells themselves. One rope in particular, thicker than the rest, swung with a restless rhythm. Poirot stood slowly. He did not slip. Hastings stared at him. "You mean he was attacked?" Poirot lifted a small piece of frayed rope from the floor, holding it delicately between his fingers. The end had been cut cleanly, purposefully. "There was a cry," he said softly. "A discordant bell, and now death." He turned toward the narrow window where snow swept past in relentless sheets. Someone did not wish Mr. Arnold Drake to hear the bells ring tonight. The ropes creaked overhead like whispering spirits, and somewhere in the depths of the ancient tower, the echo of that jarring third peal still lingered, ominous, chilling, and irreversibly binding the fate of everyone gathered in Harroway village. Chapter 3 feared death among the ropes the bells had ceased, but their echoes still trembled through the stone passages of St. Nicholas as Inspector Jonathan Archer arrived. A man of square shoulders, sharp features, and a temperament that leaned rather more toward impatience than diplomacy. His boots struck firmly against the ancient flagstones, each step announcing authority. Snow clung to the brim of his hat and melted into the dark wool of his overcoat as he surveyed the belfry landing. "Clear the stairs," he barked to the constable at his side. "No one goes up or down unless I give the word." Poirot, standing by the narrow window, gave Hastings a faint smile. "A man accustomed to command," he murmured. Hastings whispered back, "He certainly wastes no time." Inspector Archer removed his gloves with deliberate precision, his gaze falling immediately on the body of Arnold Drake. "So this is the great patron of Harroway," he muttered. "Not much left of his benevolence tonight." Reverend Paulson, pale and shaken, clasped his hands. "Inspector, it is a tragedy, a terrible accident." Archer raised an eyebrow. "Is that your professional assessment, Reverend?" Poirot stepped forward quietly. "It would be unwise, Inspector, to declare anything so soon, either accident or otherwise." Archer's eyes narrowed. "Poirot, is it? I've heard of you. This village is now a sealed crime scene, thanks to that blizzard outside. I trust you won't mind allowing me to conduct my investigation." "Malice." Poirot stopped himself, remembering his promise to avoid French expressions, and corrected gently. "But of course, Inspector, you will conduct your investigation, and I will observe." Archer seemed to grow more wary at the calm certainty in Poirot's tone. "Very well, then let us begin properly." He knelt beside Drake's body, examining the position of the limbs, the angle of the head, the dark wound. Then he looked toward the narrow stone stair that spiraled down into the shadows below. He fell, Archer declared. That's clear enough. Hastings frowned. But the wound on his head, surely. Archer cut him off. He could have struck it on the way down. These stairs are treacherous, especially in winter. Poirot crouched beside him. Inspector, would you mind indulging a simple observation? The position of the body, do you see? It is too far from the staircase. A man falling from such a height would stumble, collapse, roll perhaps. But Monsieur Drake, he lies as though placed. Archer stiffened. Are you implying he was carried? No, Poirot said softly. Not carried, but propelled. The inspector bristled. You're suggesting someone pushed him. Poirot rose to his full height and smoothed the sleeve of his coat. I suggest only that the evidence does not speak the language of accident. Before Archer could respond, the sound of slow, uneven footsteps approached. The constable ushered in an elderly man, stooped with age but possessing a wiry resilience. His silver hair peeked from beneath a worn cap, and his hands, gnarled and calloused, twitched with barely contained distress. Samuel Cole, the constable announced. Bell-ringer for 40 years. Cole removed his cap and twisted it between trembling fingers. Inspector, sir, I swear it. I was at the ropes the whole time, never left my post. Poirot studied the man carefully. Age had etched deep lines into his face, but fear had carved fresh ones. Inspector Archer's voice hardened. You rang the bells tonight? Cole nodded vigorously. Aye, sir, same as always. Only something went wrong on the third strike. Archer's gaze sharpened. Explain. Cole swallowed. The rope pulled early, before I touched it. A murmur swept through the group. Hastings blinked. You mean the bell moved by itself? Cole shook his head. No, sir. The rope jerked, as if someone above the bells had struck it. Poirot folded his arms thoughtfully. But you heard nothing? No footsteps on the stairs? No, sir. I heard only the bells and the storm. Poirot approached him gently. Mr. Cole, is it possible anyone could have slipped past you unseen, up toward the belfry? Cole's eyes widened. Impossible. The bell ropes. He gestured toward the landing. They are in plain view, and I never saw a soul. Then how do you explain, Poirot asked quietly, the early strike? Cole's mouth opened, closed, and opened again. I cannot. I wish I could, sir. Archer made a dismissive sound. The man is confused, he's elderly. Poirot turned toward the inspector, his voice soft but unmistakably firm. Age does not diminish truth, Inspector, only memory, and I do not think Mr. Cole is mistaken. Archer grunted, but said nothing. Poirot knelt again beside the body of Arnold Drake and turned his attention to a faint smear on the man's cuff. It was dark, viscous, and gleamed faintly beneath the lantern light. What is that? Hastings asked. Poirot dabbed lightly with a handkerchief, then examined the stain. Oil, he said. Black oil. Industrial incense applied recently. Inspector Archer frowned. Oil on a philanthropist's sleeve. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Arnold Drake was an industrialist. Yes, but this oil has the smell of machinery, fresh machinery. Hastings looked puzzled. But how would it have gotten on him? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he gently opened Drake's right hand. In the stiffened fingers was a scrap of red wool. Lady Eleanor gasped. Red wool? But who? Poirot held the scrap delicately. It was torn, frayed at one edge, as though snatched in haste or struggle. Archer's expression darkened. This does not sit well. A mysterious rope jerk. A mid-bell cry. A smear of oil. And now this. Poirot spoke quietly. Evidence, Inspector. Not mystery. Evidence that someone was with Mr. Drake in his final moments. The inspector rose. Then we shall find them. The roads are buried. No one is leaving this village until I am satisfied. The storm howled outside, battering the stone walls of the tower. Poirot looked toward the narrow window where snow thickened the air into a white curtain. "The village," he said softly, "is now an island, and upon this island is a murderer." Hastings felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Poirot turned away from the window and surveyed the group. Cole trembling in guilt he did not yet understand, Reverend Paulson wringing his hands, and Inspector Archer pacing like a caged hound. "We must tread carefully," Poirot murmured. "When a man dies among ropes and bells, the truth will not ring out easily." And as the snow continued to fall in relentless silence, Hercule Poirot knew that the walls around them, both of stone and of human secrecy, were closing in. Chapter 4, Faint shadows in the manor snow, clung to the windows of Harroway Manor like frostbitten lace as the household gathered once more in the great drawing-room. Only hours earlier, this room had rung with laughter, polite conversation, and the gentle hum of Christmas festivities. Now it held its breath. The ornaments on the towering fir tree glittered coldly. The garlands seemed too bright, too cheerful, grotesque reminders of a celebration shattered beyond repair. A gramophone stood in the corner, the needle still resting upon a record that had been abruptly silenced when the dreadful news arrived. Someone had attempted to restart the music once, perhaps out of misplaced politeness. But the first fragile notes of the carol had drawn such horrified stares that the machine was switched off again without ceremony. Lady Eleanor Harroway sat near the hearth, her posture poised and dignified, though her hands trembled faintly against the embroidered fabric of her gown. Firelight flickered across her features, illuminating grief but also something deeper, an exhaustion of the soul. Inspector Archer strode into the room with a command that smothered any illusion of warmth. "No one leaves," he announced. "Not until we have answers. A man is dead by violence this night." Hastings shifted uncomfortably. Poirot merely took a seat in an armchair by the fire, arranging his coat with meticulous care, as though the act might help order the tangled threads of the evening. Thomas Harroway stood near the mantel, pacing, clenched fists betraying his mounting agitation. His usually thoughtful face now bore the sharp tension of a cornered fox. Archer turned toward him. "Mr. Harroway, you were heard arguing with Arnold Drake earlier this evening. Several witnesses confirm it." Thomas froze. "We exchanged words, yes, but that hardly—" "What was the argument about?" Archer pressed. Thomas's jaw tightened. "It was a personal matter." Poirot studied him quietly. Personal matters can sometimes have very public consequences. Thomas glared at him. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying." "I imply nothing," Poirot replied serenely. "I merely observe." Lady Eleanor exhaled sharply. "Inspector, my son has endured a difficult year. There is much that troubles him, but he would never resort to violence." Archer raised a brow. "That remains to be seen." Poirot noted how Thomas flinched, not in fear, but in shame as his mother spoke. He was a man struggling under invisible burdens. Michael Trent, the organist, sat stiffly at the far end of the room, his fingers twined together. His normally serene expression had twisted into something strained. Archer turned to him next. "Mr. Trent, you left the church shortly before the bells began to ring. Why?" Michael hesitated. "I wanted air." The nave was warm from the candles. Poirot leaned forward. "And did you encounter Mr. Drake outside the church?" Michael's eyes flickered. "Briefly," Archer pounced. "What was said?" A pained silence followed. "He told me," Michael said at last, voice low, "that the church's music program was too costly, that he intended to reduce funding in the new year." "And how did you respond?" Archer asked. "I asked him to reconsider. He refused. That is all." Poirot, catching the faint tremor in Michael's hands, murmured, "It troubles you greatly, I think." Michael met his gaze. "Music is the heart of St. Nicholas. Without it, the soul of the place would diminish." Thomas scoffed. "Music, bells. Must we all pretend this is about art?" Arnold Drake was not beloved. He interfered where he had no right. Lady Eleanor sharply turned her head. "Thomas," but Thomas pressed on. "He meddled in the estate, The village, the church, and he enjoyed doing it. Inspector Archer rounded on him. So you admit resentment? Everyone resented him, Thomas snapped. Even old Samuel Cole complained. He was modernizing the bell tower to death, as if summoned by the words Samuel Cole, who had been given a seat near the door. Shifted uncomfortably, his wrinkled hands gripped his cap, twisting the fabric. Archer said, "Mr. Cole, you had reason to dislike Mr. Drake as well?" Cole flushed. "I didn't dislike him, Inspector. I disagreed with him. The bell tower has stood for centuries. Drake wanted new mechanisms, electrical nonsense. He said my way was out of fashion." Thomas murmured, "He insulted your life's work." Cole nodded, misery deepening. "Aye, but I'd never harm the man. He funded our bells." Poirot interjected softly, "And yet you stood closest to them tonight, closer than any other." Cole looked at him, eyes reddening. "Sir, I swear by my years of service, I did nothing wrong. I heard no one climb the tower. Not a single footstep." Poirot observed him carefully. The fear was real. The guilt he carried was of a different sort. Not the guilt of a killer, but that of a man who believed he had failed to protect something sacred. Lady Eleanor rose from her chair, steadiness returning to her voice. "Inspector, surely we should allow the guests to rest. They have endured." Archer cut her off. "No one rests yet. Not until we establish timelines and movements. The murderer may be among us." Thomas exhaled sharply. "Inspector Archer, perhaps your energies would be better spent determining how someone could commit such an act unnoticed." Poirot's eyes drifted across the faces illuminated by firelight. Thomas's agitation was raw. Electric Michael Trent sat with stiff shoulders but shifting eyes. Samuel Cole watched the flames with despair. Lady Eleanor kept her composure, though her fingers betrayed her by tightening just once more along the edge of the mantle. Poirot noted one more thing. Of all those gathered, only one person had not shivered since they entered the room. Not from cold, not from fear, not from guilt. Poirot did not yet name that person, nor did he reveal what significance the observation held, but he tucked the detail away carefully, like a chess piece placed for a future move. As the fire crackled and the storm clawed at the manor walls, the tension thickened until even Hastings felt it like a weight in the air. "Poirot," Hastings whispered, "do you truly think the murderer is here, in this very room?" Poirot's gaze moved from face to face, lingering on each one for an equal measure of time. "My friend," he replied calmly, "whoever killed Arnold Drake did not vanish into the snow. The storm protects us from the outside, but it also traps us with the truth." Inspector Archer continued his questioning. Voices clashed, confessions half-spoken, resentments exposed like raw wounds. And Hercule Poirot, with eyes half-lidded in contemplation, watched the shadows dance on the walls of Harroway Manor, knowing that human shadows were far more dangerous. Chapter 5: Fey Footprints, and a lantern by morning. The storm had exhausted itself. Harroway Village lay beneath a vast, unbroken sweep of white that glimmered beneath a weak sun struggling through thinning clouds. The snow that had fallen overnight had turned the landscape into a perfect ledger, every footstep recorded, every movement preserved in crisp relief. It was, Poirot reflected as he stepped out into the cold air, a rare gift from nature to the detective's art. Captain Hastings trudged beside him, coat buttoned to the throat. "I must say, Poirot," he muttered, "Inspector Archer seemed in no mood to let us near the church again. Are you certain this is wise?" "We do not ask permission," Poirot replied calmly. "We simply walk, mon ami, and we observe. The truth waits for those who attend to the small things." Hastings sighed but followed. The path to St. Nicholas wound gently uphill to the villagers. It was familiar ground. To Poirot, it was a stage upon which last night's tragedy had left faint but crucial traces. As they approached, the church rose solemnly before them, its stone walls dusted with fresh snow, its tower stark against the pale sky. The main path leading to the church doors was scattered with footprints from the congregation, indistinct, overlapping patterns of boots and shoes. But Poirot did not waste a moment on the obvious. Instead, he turned toward the left side of the building, where snow lay undisturbed, except for two clear sets of tracks. "Do you see Hastings?" Poirot asked softly. Hastings leaned down. "Two walkers. But going where? That door is hardly used." The side door, small and iron-banded, was indeed rarely opened except for maintenance of the heating pipes and storage alcoves. Poirot examined the tracks more closely. "One set," he said, gesturing with a gloved hand, "is deep firm. The gait is confident, a man walking with purpose. And the other?" Hastings asked. Poirot crouched, fingertips hovering a hair's breadth above the snow. "The second set is lighter, hesitant. Notice how the steps overlap, how the surface is brushed. Someone attempted to obscure them." Hastings exhaled slowly, so they were trying not to be noticed. Poirot rose. "Just so two people came here last night. One of them wished the visit forgotten." Hastings hesitated. "But which set belongs to Drake?" Poirot shook his head. "Drake would have entered by the main door, where the villagers gathered. Whoever came here did so with secrecy." He pushed lightly against the side door. To Hastings's surprise, it yielded. "Unlocked," Poirot murmured. "Interesting." Inside, the air was cold, still, and faintly tinged with the scent of old wax and damp stone. The passage ran only a few yards before opening into a small antechamber. Adjoining the base of the tower, a row of wooden shelves lined the wall, usually home to lanterns, spare candles, and rope. Poirot ran his finger along the shelves. "One lantern is missing." Hastings blinked. "Are you certain? It looks quite full to me." Poirot pointed. "See the dust pattern? 3 lanterns stood here before. Only 2 remain. And look, on the ground, in a faint line leading toward the door, were tiny droplets, irregular, translucent, and almost forgotten by the cold." "Wax?" Hastings whispered. Poirot shook his head. "Number melted snow. Droplets left by an object brought indoors from the storm. An object that continued to shed water as it warmed. A lantern perhaps carried still warm from use." Hastings frowned. "But why take a lantern out of the church? There are lamps along the main path." "Indeed. Why take it? Why return it here, rather than the vestry where it belongs? Every act has intention, my friend." They continued deeper into the passage, arriving at the spiral staircase ascending to the belfry. Poirot paused on the first step, his gaze fixed upon a small pale blur on the stone. A drop of wax. Hastings stared. "But no one carries candles up to the tower, only lamps, those glass, shielded ones, for safety." Poirot nodded slowly. "Exactly. There should be no candle wax at all upon these stairs." He crouched again, lifting the tiny flake of hardened wax. It gleamed faintly in the dim light. "A candle was carried up this staircase last night," Poirot said quietly. "And yet the bell-ringers use lamps. So who brings a candle? One who does not wish the light to be seen from afar." "A clandestine visitor," Hastings murmured. Poirot's eyes shone. "More than that. A clandestine visitor whose wax has a particular color." He showed Hastings the fleck. "It is pale, not white, but cream, a shade often used in hand-dipped candles, not church stock." "Someone had brought their own candle," Hastings said, astonished. "But why?" Poirot's fingers closed over the wax. "To see without being seen, or perhaps," he added, "to mask another purpose." Poirot paused often, examining each mark, each irregularity. The stone staircase bore no signs of a struggle. No scuffs, no hurried scrapes, no skid marks indicating a fall. It was, in fact, eerily undisturbed. "Drake did not stumble here," Poirot murmured, "and he did not fight here. This passage tells us nothing of violence." Hastings swallowed. "But that means that the struggle occurred in the belfry itself," Poirot finished. "Drake ascended alive, but not alone." They reached the landing where the heavy wooden door to the belfry stood slightly ajar, still warped from the previous night's impact. Poirot touched it gently, noting the faint indentations left by forceful contact. Then he turned back to Hastings. Let us reconstruct. Mon ami. A person enters the church by the side door. They carry a lantern, perhaps borrowed, perhaps stolen. They meet another, or follow another, 2 sets of footprints. Hastings nodded, breath misting in the cold air. One climbs the tower with a candle. Poirot continued. They reach the belfry, where Arnold Drake waits, or is lured. And then? Hastings asked. Poirot's eyes glinted. Then comes the discordant ring, the cry, the fall. He stepped toward the window, where the sun cast a pale beam across the snow-laden village. The snow has trapped the murderer within Harroway village, Poirot said softly. And the clues, if one is patient, will reveal which of our companions walks with guilt hidden beneath their footprints. Hastings felt a prick of unease. Poirot, do you already suspect someone? Poirot turned, the wax still held delicately between his fingertips. I suspect, he replied, that last night's visitor to the belfry had no intention of ringing in Christmas with goodwill. He slipped the wax into his pocket. And now, Hastings, we must discover whose candle burned in the tower, and whose conscience burns still. Chapter 6. Face Secrets of Arnold Drake. The morning light, creeping into Harroway Manor, was brittle and colorless, casting long icicle-like shadows across the corridors. The festive ribbons hung limply now, their bright cheer muted by the thick atmosphere of unease that had settled overnight. Even the servants moved with hushed urgency, as though fearing that the very walls might be listening. Poirot and Hastings made their way to Arnold Drake's guest room, a chamber on the eastern side of the manor, where the windows overlooked the snow-laden orchards. A pair of constables stood at the door, though Inspector Archer had reluctantly agreed to allow Poirot to examine the room. His disapproval lingered in the air like smoke. Inside, the room smelled faintly of charred paper and cold metal. Drake's luggage lay half unpacked, as if he had been too impatient to bother with order. On the writing desk near the hearth, an inkpot stood beside a scattering of papers, some folded neatly, others abandoned mid. Thought Poirot approached them with gentle precision. Hastings peered over his shoulder. He appears to have been quite occupied last night. Poirot shook his head thoughtfully. Occupied, yes, but also troubled. Monsieur Drake was not a man accustomed to disorder. His chaos here suggests agitation. He lifted a stack of letters bound loosely with a ribbon. The topmost bore the Harroway seal. From Lady Eleanor, Poirot murmured. He skimmed the contents, Hastings reading with widening eyes. Good heavens! Hastings breathed. These are financial records, Drake. He practically owned the estate. Poirot nodded. He had acquired their debts little by little. With such leverage, he controlled not only the land but the fate of the family. Hastings frowned. Why would Lady Eleanor trust a man like Drake? Was she desperate? Poirot set the letter down, perhaps. Or perhaps Drake presented his help as an act of friendship. There are those, mon ami, who cloak predation in generosity. He continued, leafing through the correspondence. One envelope, thick and yellowed, contained a set of legal drafts outlining rights of acquisition. Another held a memorandum detailing upcoming expansions of Drake's factories, plans that would require access to certain Harroway-owned woodlands. Poirot paused. Ah, here is the motive. Financial, ruthless, inevitable. Hastings scanned the page. He wanted to force Lady Eleanor to sell a portion of her land, but why after Christmas? Because, Poirot replied softly, a holiday is a powerful mask. One may hide a dagger beneath goodwill. Drake intended to deliver his ultimatum once the festivities ended, which would make his coercion appear merely businesslike, not cruel. Near the desk's edge lay a small metal tray, holding the charred remains of burned paper. Poirot stooped, lifting one of the half-burned fragments with the delicacy of a surgeon. Hastings squinted. Is that Drake's handwriting? Poirot nodded slowly. Yes. The loops of his script remain, though the edges are scorched. See, this was a letter he intended to keep secret. The fragment's text was incomplete, but a few words remained legible. No further extensions. Land to be signed over, discuss with Lady Eleanor on the 26th. Hastings's jaw tightened. He was going to ruin the Harraways. Poirot let the fragment fall gently back into place. It would have been a scandal of the worst kind, a Christmas turned into catastrophe. He turned toward the wardrobe next, a large imposing structure carved from dark oak. Inside hung Drake's substantial coats, his heavy boots, and several walking sticks. On the top shelf, Poirot found a small locked box. Hastings retrieved the key from Drake's overcoat pocket, where it had been tucked carelessly, as though he thought the box of little interest to others. Inside was a collection of letters, personal, private, and in some cases, venomous. One letter in particular caught Poirot's attention. "It is addressed to Thomas Harraway," he said. Hastings leaned forward. "But the envelope is empty." "Not entirely." Poirot held it close to the light. Along the inner fold was a faint dark smear, almost invisible but unmistakable. "Oil," Poirot whispered. "The very same as on Drake's cuff," Hastings exhaled. "Then Thomas handled this letter recently, but why remove the contents?" Poirot folded the envelope. "Always the question, Hastings, not what is missing, but why it is missing." He turned to examine the room more fully. "Let us consider. Drake writes Thomas a letter on the morning of his death, refusing further time, threatening consequences. Thomas reads it. He reacts. Perhaps the reaction is emotional, perhaps not, but afterward, Thomas removes the letter from its envelope. For what purpose? Hastings asked. Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, that is the crux. If the letter contained only Drake's refusal, why destroy or hide it? But if it contained something more," Hastings blinked. "Something incriminating. Something Thomas didn't want others to see. Possibly, but we must also ask, did Thomas remove the contents? Or did another?" Poirot took a slow walk around the room, observing every detail. Footprints, faint impressions in the carpet, suggested movement between the desk, the hearth, and the wardrobe. Drake had paced. He had burned papers. He had written correspondence right up until he left for the church service. Poirot paused at the window, where frost crept like delicate feathers across the glass. Drake was under siege from every side. Resented, feared, perhaps even hated. But he was also a man who preferred control. Someone disturbed that control last night. Hastings folded his arms. "Do you think Thomas confronted Drake at the church after reading the letter?" Poirot tilted his head. "Perhaps, but a confrontation alone does not explain murder. Let us remember, someone brought a candle to the tower. Someone used the vestry lantern. Someone brushed away footprints. And someone left bell oil behind," Hastings added. Poirot nodded approvingly. "Yes, bell oil, rare, specific, found on Drake's cuff, and now on this envelope. A strange coincidence. Nest," he caught himself, then smiled wryly. "A strange coincidence indeed." A knock at the door startled Hastings. A maid stood trembling on the threshold. "Sirs, Lady Eleanor requests your presence in the blue parlor. Inspector Archer is gathering everyone." Poirot exchanged a look with Hastings. "A gathering, my friend, is always fruitful. The guilty often falter when brought into the light." As they left the room, Poirot cast one last glance behind him. Arnold Drake's papers lay arranged in quiet testimony to schemes he would never complete. His secrets, however, were far from silent. Poirot murmured as he closed the door, "Where there is power, Hastings, there is danger, and where there is danger, one must look most closely, not at the loud quarrels, but at the quiet documents." And now, with the estate sealed under snow, and the cast assembled by fate, he felt the strands of the mystery draw tighter, each clue a thread leading ever closer to a single truth hidden among the cold, the bells, and the shadows of Harraway Manor. Chapter 7. The music of the bell's snow still drifted lightly over Harraway village, as Poirot made his way once more to St. Nicholas. The storm's fury had faded, leaving a muted landscape of white and shadow. The church, steadfast against the cold, seemed to hum faintly with the memory of the previous night's discordant peal, an echo that lingered in stone as much as in the minds of its parishioners. Inside, the nave was dim except for a few candles at the chancel. The organ pipes towered like solemn sentinels above the empty pews. As Poirot and Hastings stepped through the doorway, a somber melody rolled out from the organ, deep, mournful chords that clung to the air like unspoken grief. "It isn't exactly a Christmas tune," Hastings murmured. Poirot nodded. "None." "Ah, forgive me, number it is not. It is a lament." They approached the organ loft. Michael Trent sat at the bench, his back straight but tense, fingers drifting over the keys with a kind of mechanical sorrow. The music faltered when he heard them, and he lowered his hands with a sigh of resignation rather than surprise. "Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings," Trent said quietly, "I wondered when you might return." Poirot offered a gentle inclination of the head. "You choose a melancholy piece for the morning after such a tragic event." "It felt wrong to play the carols," Trent replied. "The bells were meant to herald a joyful night. But now," his voice strained, "what joy is left?" Poirot let the silence linger for a moment before speaking again. "I would ask you a question or two about the bells, if you permit." "Of course." Poirot gestured toward the music stand beside the organ. Upon it lay a folded sheet of paper, smooth from use but marked with handwritten notes and timings. "This is the schedule for the midnight ringing." Trent nodded. "Yes, I prepared it earlier in the week, so Samuel Cole would know the precise timing for each peal. It helps coordinate the organ accompaniment." Poirot unfolded the sheet with careful hands. Columns of rhythm notations, second counts, and bell assignments covered the page. All but one entry remained untouched. One line showed correction: bell 3 face strike at 0 hours 1 minute, and 14 seconds. A second notation had been crossed out and replaced. The correction moved the strike earlier by several seconds. Hastings leaned closer. "Good heavens, that bell was the one that rang out of time." Trent stiffened. "Yes, but I did not change that marking." Poirot studied his face. "You are certain?" "Absolutely," Trent swallowed. "I rely entirely on Mr. Drake's patronage. Without it, I could not keep my position here. I had no desire, no reason, to sabotage the ceremony." Poirot believed him. Trent's pallor, the tremor in his voice, the quiet dread that seeped from his posture, none of it held the defensive sharpness of guilt. It was fear, honest and unvarnished. "He is a man whose life depends on the goodwill of others," Poirot thought. "Not a man who strikes at his own livelihood." Poirot folded the schedule. "Tell me, Mr. Trent, who else had access to this paper?" Trent frowned. "Several people, I suppose. The vestry is not locked during the day. Reverend Paulson saw it. Samuel Cole glanced at it briefly during rehearsal. And," his voice faltered, "Thomas Haraway asked to borrow it yesterday evening." Hastings blinked. "Thomas, what did he want with the bell schedule?" Trent hesitated. "He said he wished to understand the ceremony better. He seemed agitated." Poirot filed the detail away. "And when did you last see the schedule? Before last night?" "I placed it here in the afternoon. When I returned after the service, the change was already made." Poirot nodded slowly. The handwriting of the alteration did not match Trent's careful looping script. The ink was darker, fresh, deliberate. Someone had altered the timing of the bells intentionally. Hastings frowned. But what would that achieve? Confuse the bell ringer, distract Drake? Poirot's eyes glinted. Or create a moment, a single jarring moment, enough to mask a cry or a blow? He moved around the organ loft, noting every detail. A metronome sat unused beside a stack of sheet music, a thermos of cold tea, a wool coat draped over a pew, and on the back of Trent's chair, a bright red scarf hung neatly. Poirot approached it. "This is yours, Mr. Trent." "Yes, a gift from a parishioner last winter." Poirot lifted the fabric gently. The knitting was fine, the wool soft and the scarf intact. No tears, no frayed edges. "Good," Poirot murmured. Hastings looked puzzled. "Why, Poirot," Poirot returned the scarf to its place. Because the scrap of red wool found in Drake's hand came from a garment that is torn. This is not torn. Trent paled. Scrap of wool. Poirot nodded. Your scarf is not the source. Relief washed over Trent, though it did little to ease his overall anxiety. Poirot observed him for another moment, the drawn face, the weary slump of his posture. Mr. Trent, Poirot said softly, you mentioned last night that Drake threatened to cut funding to the music program. Trent's shoulders tightened. Yes, he said it was too expensive. He called it sentimental frippery. He believed people came to church for sermons, not for beauty. Beauty, however, Poirot replied gently, is often the soul's anchor. Trent looked away. I suppose he did not feel the weight of such things. Poirot studied the organist's expression. There was sorrow there, but not anger. Fear, but not hatred, as motives went. Trent had reason to resent Drake. But resentment alone is not fire enough for murder. Poirot stepped down from the loft. One final question, Mr. Trent. Did you notice anything unusual last night? Anything at all? Trent hesitated. Only that, during the rehearsal 2 days ago, I heard someone speaking in the belfry softly, as though in conversation, but when I climbed the stairs, no one was there. Poirot's brows rose. A conversation between whom? I do not know. But the voices, there were two, one deep, one anxious. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. This fit too neatly with the hidden tensions he had already sensed. Merci. He stopped himself with a sigh. My apologies. Thank you, Mr. Trent. You have been most helpful. As they exited the church, Hastings spoke in a low voice. Poirot, do you think Thomas was the anxious voice? He seems under pressure from every angle. Poirot paused on the path, gazing across the snowy expanse toward Harroway Manor. My friend, he said softly, I think many people in Harroway Village spoke anxiously to Arnold Drake in recent days. He brushed a snowflake from his sleeve, but only one exchanged words with him in the belfry at midnight. And with that, they made their way back through the pale, quiet morning, toward a house full of secrets and a truth drawing ever closer to its moment of revelation. Chapter 8. Fay clearing, the innocent the sun, hung low over Harroway Village, casting pale rays through the lingering curtain of frost. Though morning edged toward noon, the cold air clung to the rooftops and hedges like a reminder that winter had claimed both the land and its secrets. Poirot and Hastings returned to the manor, just as Inspector Archer completed another round of questioning, one marked by sharp tones, stammered responses, and little clarity. But clarity, Poirot reflected, did not always emerge from interrogation. Sometimes it emerged from collapse. They found Samuel Cole seated by the kitchen hearth, his weathered frame hunched over a mug of tea he did not drink. His fingers trembled violently, though whether from cold or distress was difficult to tell. When Poirot approached, Cole looked up, and whatever fragile composure he had left finally shattered. I must speak, he choked out. I cannot keep it to myself any longer. Poirot lowered himself onto the bench beside him. Then speak, mon ami. The truth is a weight that grows heavier in silence. Cole's voice broke. I left the ropes. Hastings blinked. You left the ropes, but you said... I lied, Cole whispered. I was ashamed and afraid. After all these years, if anything went wrong during the bells, everyone would blame me. Poirot placed a steadying hand on the man's arm. Tell us exactly what happened. Cole stared into the flames, as if the truth lay burning inside them. Just before midnight, just before the bells, I heard something on the stair. A creak, a soft one. Too soft for a grown man, I thought. I thought it might be Thomas Harroway playing a trick again. He's climbed those stairs before to startle me. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. Cole continued. So I stepped away. Only for a moment, to look up the lower steps. I swear it was no more than half a minute, but in that moment someone could have passed me. Yes, Poirot said softly. Someone could. Cole's shoulders sagged. When the bells rang wrong, when Drake fell, I thought it was my fault, that if I hadn't stepped away, his voice cracked. I should have stayed. Even if it was nothing, I should have stayed. Poirot raised a hand to stop the self-blame. Mr. Cole, listen carefully. Your absence was brief, and though it allowed the murderer a narrow window, do not mistake opportunity for capability. He lifted Cole's hands gently. The joints were swollen, twisted with age, barely able to grip a teacup without strain. These hands, Poirot said, cannot deliver the violent push needed to send a strong man to his death in the belfry, nor could they have cut the rope in haste, nor wrestled with a man as large as Mr. Drake. Your fears are understandable, but your guilt is misplaced. Tears spilled into the creases of Cole's cheeks. So you believe me innocent? Poirot nodded, without question. Inspector Archer, who had entered just in time to hear the confession, opened his mouth to object, but Poirot's calm, decisive tone stilled him. Archer muttered something about overly sympathetic methods, then retreated, leaving the detective to his work. Revisiting the alibis later, Poirot gathered Hastings in the Manor's library, where he began the slow, deliberate dismantling of every account given the night before. Let us review, Poirot said, pacing between shelves heavy with leather. Bound tomes. Samuel Cole's absence affords opportunity, but not strength. He could not have overpowered Drake. Agreed, Hastings said. Michael Trent, Poirot continued, possessed motive, financial fear, but his manner is gentle, his dependence on Drake absolute. He lacks the disposition for violence, and, Poirot added, his alibi in the nave is supported by multiple witnesses. Hastings nodded. And the red scarf intact. Just so. Poirot next considered Reverend Paulson, a man of peace, overwhelmed by the tragedy. His sorrow is genuine. More importantly, he was surrounded by parishioners throughout the early bells. He cannot be the culprit. And Lady Eleanor? Hastings asked. Poirot paused. Her motives are subtle. She feared Drake's intentions. She feared for her son. Yet she is a woman whose weapons are persuasion, not physical confrontation. Her actions show desperation. Yes, but not aggression. Then who remains? Hastings asked. Poirot walked to the window, where the world outside lay muffled beneath snow. His eyes softened, never unfocused but distant, as if studying a pattern invisible to all but him. The Haraway household, he murmured. Their movements remain the most uncertain, their resentments the deepest, their silence the most practiced. Hastings frowned. Thomas, you think, Thomas? Poirot lifted a hand. Let us not rush, but consider the clues. Mon ami, the scrap of red wool in Drake's hand, yet Thomas's winter coat is lined with a red scarf, one frayed at the edges, not torn but prone to catching. And the oil on the envelope in Drake's room, Hastings added. Precisely, bell oil. And who among the household had cause to visit the bell tower recently? Hastings thought for a moment. Thomas asked Trent for the bell schedule. Poirot nodded. And someone altered it. Someone who needed the third bell to ring early. He turned back from the window. But it is not only these clues that lead me. There is more. What else? Poirot steepled his fingers. Last night, at the church's side entrance, I examined the handle. I detected a faint but unmistakable scent. Hastings waited. Tobacco, Poirot said quietly. A particular rich blend, not cigarettes, but fine pipe tobacco, and mingled with it brandy. Hastings blinked. But who in the household smokes a pipe? Poirot answered without hesitation. Thomas Haraway. A hush settled over the room. The truth did not yet reveal itself, but it breathed, lurking like a shadow in the space between certainty and proof. But, Poirot added softly, we do not yet condemn, we observe. We verify. We follow the final threads. He looked toward the corridor beyond the library, where Thomas's footsteps echoed faintly. The innocent, Poirot said, must be cleared. Only then does guilt reveal its rightful face. And with that, he began preparing for the confrontation he knew was inevitable, one that would unravel the final secrets of Harroway Manor. Chapter 9. The gathering at Harroway Manor. Evening descended with a heavy, wintry hush upon Harroway Manor. The snow outside muffled all sound, as though the world itself were waiting. The great drawing room, once bright with carols and candlelight, now glowed faintly under dimmed lamps. The Christmas tree, which only a night earlier had sparkled with festive cheer, now cast long and somber shadows across the carpet. Its ornaments glimmered like silent witnesses. At Poirot's request, the household and key figures from the investigation assembled: Lady Eleanor, regal yet trembling; Thomas Harroway, pale and restless; Inspector Archer, jaw set with irritation and anticipation; Reverend Paulson, clasping his prayer book; Michael Trent, twisting his fingers anxiously; and Samuel Cole, huddled in a straight-backed chair near the fire. Captain Hastings stood near the mantel, tense as Poirot moved to address the room. Poirot did not begin immediately. Instead, he surveyed each face with grave politeness, his hands folded lightly before him. The air carried a brittle intensity, fragile, dangerous, inevitable. Mes amis, Poirot caught himself, lifting a hand apologetically. My friends, thank you for gathering. I believe it is time to lay before you the truth of what transpired last night at St. Nicholas. Thomas exhaled sharply. Lady Eleanor's fingers tightened around her handkerchief. Inspector Archer crossed his arms. Poirot continued. Let us begin with the facts. The small, seemingly insignificant details that together compose a most precise picture. He stepped toward the fireplace where the flames crackled softly. First, he said, we have the bell schedule, meticulously written by Mr. Trent, yet containing one alteration. The third bell moved earlier by several seconds. This change was not in Mr. Trent's hand, nor was it done by Mr. Cole, who never handled the document long enough to amend it. No, it was changed by someone who wished to create a moment of confusion. Archer snorted. A moment of confusion, hardly a motive for murder. Poirot gave him a gentle look. On the contrary, Inspector, a single discordant chime, unexpected, jarring, was enough to mask the brief cry of a man struggling for his life. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Poirot continued, voice steady. Second, the missing vestry lantern and the footprints leading to the side door of the church. 2 sets, one purposeful, one hesitant and partially brushed away. A clandestine meeting took place. One of the walkers tried to conceal their presence. He faced Thomas briefly, one who wished to go unseen. Thomas's jaw tightened. Though he said nothing, Poirot pressed on. Third, the candle wax on the belfry stairs, where no candle should ever be. Someone climbed the tower not with a lantern which would be visible from outside, but with a candle shielding its flame. Reverend Paulson murmured a prayer under his breath. Fourth, Poirot said, lifting one finger, the scrap of red wool found in the dead man's hand. Mr. Trent's scarf was intact. Mr. Cole does not own clothing of such color. Reverend Paulson neither. Inspector Archer, your coat is grey. Lady Eleanor, you do not wear scarves indoors. Poirot turned his full attention to Thomas. But you, Mr. Harroway, own a coat with a red wool lining, one frayed at the edges, a piece easily snagged by a desperate hand. Lady Eleanor's breath caught. Thomas's face blanched. Fifth, Poirot announced. We have the fragment of rope found upon the belfry floor. Its end was cut, cleanly, purposefully, not the fraying of age, but the work of a sharp blade. Someone had prepared, earlier in the day, to make the third bell miss-strike. An act of sabotage meant to jar the service at a precise moment, without entirely ruining it. A childish humiliation, perhaps, but not yet murder. A murmur passed through the room. Sixth, Poirot continued, the bell oil on Drake's cuff, a rare scent, not common on Christmas garments. Yet someone's coat carried it. Someone who had recently visited the tower, who had brushed against the ropes and the iron frame, while testing their little adjustment to the bells. Thomas swallowed hard. Poirot held up the empty envelope found in Drake's room. And seventh, the envelope addressed to Thomas Harroway, empty but marked with that same bell oil. The letter it once contained was removed, perhaps destroyed. Inspector Archer leaned forward. Drake wrote that letter on the morning of his death. A refusal, a threat. Poirot nodded. Indeed, the letter stated that Drake would force the Harroways to sell a portion of their land, ruining their position, their heritage, their security. He let the words settle, then added, "And there is more. When we returned from the church last night, the storm had bitten everyone. Each person shivered by the fire, save one. Only you, Mr. Harroway, did not shiver at all. Your clothes were already warmed, your chill already driven off. You had been inside longer than you claimed." Thomas's face drained of color. "And finally," Poirot said softly, 2 days before the service, Mr. Trent heard voices in the belfry during rehearsal, one deep, one anxious, Mr. Drake, no doubt, and the man whose fate he held. Your voice, Mr. Harroway. You had already taken your quarrel with him up among the bells once before." Thomas's voice finally broke. "You don't understand. I only wanted—" Poirot raised a hand. "Please, Mr. Harroway, allow me to finish." The room went still. Poirot's tone softened, though it lost none of its precision. Arnold Drake was a powerful man, a man who delighted in control. He summoned you last night, or you summoned him. Either way, the meeting was clandestine. You took the side door, your scent of tobacco and brandy remained upon the handle, and you borrowed the vestry lantern to light your way. Lady Eleanor pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. Poirot continued. You lured him up the tower. Perhaps you intended only to speak, to plead once more for time, but he refused you again. And in the belfry itself, near the open door to the landing, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He seized you in fear, in anger. We may never know, but he grabbed your coat, hence the wool in his fist, and as he struggled, the oil from your coat, picked up from the bell mechanisms you had examined earlier, brushed onto his cuff. Poirot's voice became quieter. In that moment, desperation overcame reason. You pushed him. One violent shove in that confined space, and he staggered backward, struck his head, and fell hard to the stones of the landing. Thomas staggered backward, as though struck. Lady Eleanor cried out softly. Michael Trent looked ill. Samuel Cole closed his eyes in despair. Inspector Archer stepped forward. Thomas Harroway, you are under. Poirot lifted a single finger. Not yet, Inspector. Archer froze. Poirot's gaze held Thomas's. Thomas Harroway did push Arnold Drake. That is true. But, Inspector, it was not murder in cold blood. It was not premeditated in the way you imagine. Thomas's breath hitched. Poirot, please. Poirot approached him slowly. You altered the bell schedule to conceal the meeting, not the crime. You wished merely for privacy. You intended only to bargain, to beg for mercy for your family. Thomas's voice trembled. He told me he would announce the sale on the 26th, that he didn't care what it did to my mother. He laughed. Laughed at us. Lady Eleanor burst into quiet tears. Thomas continued, voice cracking. I lost control. For a moment, just a moment, I pushed him aside. I didn't mean for him to fall. I swear it. Poirot nodded gently. And yet he did fall, and he died. The silence was frozen. Absolute. Poirot stepped back, folding his hands. Inspector Archer, he said quietly, you have your culprit. Archer placed a heavy hand on Thomas's shoulder. Thomas Harroway, you will come with me. Lady Eleanor rose, her voice breaking. Thomas, my dear boy. Thomas turned to her, defeated. I only tried to save us, Mother. Poirot looked upon the scene with a heavy heart. This, he murmured, is the tragedy of desperation. It turns the frightened into the violent, and the innocent into the condemned. The drawing-room fell silent as Thomas Harroway was led away, his head bowed, his footsteps slow, like a man walking through deep snow toward a fate he could no longer escape. And above them all, the dim lights of the Christmas tree flickered softly, like the final, fading echoes of a bell whose tone had wavered only once, but forever changed the course of a village's winter night. Chapter 10. The last stroke of midnight. The confession, when it came, was not dramatic. It did not erupt in fury, nor unfold with the cunning twists that Inspector Archer had half expected. It came quietly, broken, halting, and filled with the weary resignation of a young man who had carried too heavy a burden for too long. Thomas Harroway stood before them, shoulders slumped, the last vestige of defiance drained from his posture. Snowflakes drifting through the open doorway melted on the collar of his coat. He looked not like a murderer, but like a ghost pale, hollow, aid already fading from the life he had known. "I only meant to frighten him," Thomas whispered. "I swear it. I wanted him to listen, to understand what he was doing to us. I wanted him to feel, for one moment, the fear he had pressed upon our family for months." Poirot watched him with an expression free of triumph. There was no satisfaction in this ending, only inevitability. Thomas continued, voice cracking. "But when he laughed, when he said he would destroy us without hesitation, I lost control. My anger, it swallowed everything. I shoved him away. He stumbled against the bell frame, then toward the open doorway to the landing. I didn't think. I didn't realize how close he was to the edge. And then he choked. The memory consumed him. Lady Eleanor stood frozen, gripping the back of a chair so tightly her knuckles whitened. The room was silent except for the faint hiss of snow against the window panes. Thomas lifted his eyes toward her. They were red, rimmed, desperate. "Mother, I didn't mean for it to happen. I never meant." She didn't step forward. She didn't speak. She simply looked at him, and in that gaze lay the full measure of her shattered heart. A mother's love had not diminished, but trust, hope, and future lay fractured on the hearthstones of Harroway Manor. Inspector Archer cleared his throat, though even he seemed subdued. "Thomas Harroway, you will come with me. You will be charged accordingly. The courts will decide the nature of your guilt." Thomas nodded, as if relieved that the waiting, at least, was over. Archer took him gently by the arm, leading him toward the door. Lady Eleanor swayed slightly, as if the weight of all she had endured had finally pressed her downward. Poirot stepped toward her. "Lady Eleanor," he said softly, "sometimes it is not wickedness but desperation that drives a man to violence. Your son was cornered, by circumstance, by fear, by the ruthlessness of a man who knew his power too well." She lifted her chin, tears brimming. "It does not change what he has done." "No," Poirot agreed quietly. "But sometimes the heart understands what the law cannot." They watched as Thomas disappeared into the swirling snow, his figure swallowed by the night. Later that night the village lay silent under a pale moon, its rooftops shimmering like porcelain beneath the frost. A gentle wind drifted between the buildings, carrying with it the faint scent of pine from the decorated square at St. Nicholas. Light glowed from within the tower. Reverend Paulson stood in the belfry alone, hands resting on the ropes. His breath clouded in the cold air as he bowed his head. Tonight the bells would ring not in celebration, but in remembrance. With a deep breath, he pulled the first rope. The bell tolled, deep and resonant. Then the second, steady measured. The third followed, pure and true, no discord marring its tone. The sound rippled across the valley, filling the air with solemn grace. Poirot and Hastings, walking along the path back to Harroway Manor, stopped for a moment to listen. Snow crunched softly beneath their shoes as they turned toward the church. "How different the bells sound tonight," Hastings murmured, "clearer, as if they know their purpose." Poirot adjusted his scarf against the cold. "Last night, mon ami," he caught himself with a faint smile. "My friend, the bells were used as a veil, a mask, but tonight they speak honestly." Hastings sighed. "It's a sad business, Poirot. A terrible end to Christmas." Poirot nodded. "Yes, but human nature does not halt for holidays. Even in the season of goodwill, fear and pride can take root in a troubled heart." The fourth bell tolled across the village, echoing against the distant hills. Poirot gazed upward. The conscience, Hastings, is much like those bells. One may try to silence it, to muffle it with excuses, anger, or desperation. But in the end, he tapped a gloved finger gently against his temple. It strikes its note, clear, inescapable, inevitably heard. Hastings looked at him, troubled. "Do you think Thomas will ever find peace?" Poirot considered. "In time, perhaps, if he learns to understand his weakness, not hide from it. The law will judge him. But peace is a journey of the soul." Poirot and Hastings resumed their walk, their figures moving slowly through the moonlit path. The village remained still, listening to the fading echo, and as the last vibration dissolved into the crisp winter night, Poirot murmured, "Midnight has struck. Hastings, the truth has spoken, and with it, perhaps, the hope that tomorrow may toll with greater light." Behind them, the bells of St. Nicholas stood silent once more. Yet their message lingered, a reminder that even amid the chill of winter, truth endures, conscience awakens, and justice, however sorrowful, eventually finds its voice.